Well, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Johnson. I serve on the English faculty here, and I'm also the director of Verse Like Water, the visiting poet program of Central Lakes College, and I'm so happy that you came to this poetry reading. I have a very brief introduction in my pretentious binder, as usual, but first we'll start out with a couple of business notes. Make sure you do the right thing with your mobile phone and turn that ringer off. And just to how the day will go, Forrest Gander is going to read for 45 minutes or so, and then he'll sign books outside the Chalberg. And he'd be very happy to sign one and shake your hand and meet you and greet you. All books, poetry readings begin with thanks and praise. And I want to thank our sponsors today, the Minnesota Legacy Fund, Five Wings Arts Council, and NPR. I forgot to mention there's a craft talk also following the book signing at 1:30. And for the first time ever, I want to thank heaven for giving us a break in the clouds so we can be together at 100% occupancy. It's not impossible also that we've gotten supernatural help from the muse I want to invoke, the bicycle poet of San Francisco, St. Lawrence Ferlinghetti. Verse Like Water concludes this afternoon its 10th year of hosting readings with our most important poets. We have been bringing you writers across the pandemic. And now, life during wartime nudges me to quote someone I'm just beginning to be friends with, the Ukrainian writer Axel Melnyzuk, who last week wrote, "Even amidst the madness of war, it is necessary to create those open spaces so the soul can breathe. Poetry opens such spaces. I feel like the luckiest of men to be calling Forrest Gander into this space today, here in our cozy Chalberg Theater, and I'm having the time of my life reintroducing him to Minnesota. His poet heart is wide open to our humanity, and his geologist heart is appreciating the topography of our terrain with its water, our forests, and my personal red osier dogwood, which is flaring now with the warmth of spring. Yesterday, I had the luck to watch Forrest encounter Brother John Chrysostom at St. John's Abbey and watch him suddenly speak fluent Japanese, reciting a poem he knew John would have learned as a child. In that moment, I remembered that while Forrest is principally a poet, he's also a gifted translator, like some of the writers who have read for us. For centuries, poets have been lovingly translating one another across language, time, and cultures, and I think this is the essence of their work. The great ones, always prodigious noticers, also translate the world to readers and offer us projections that translate, sign, and signify us to ourselves with love and patience and wonder. I know many of you, like me, are grateful for the beautiful books they make for us, which are also elegant, definitive mirrors. Billy Collins frets that we may be near a time where everything in the world will have been compared to something else, and that we'll have to close our pens and fold our hands with nothing more to do. But I have no such worry. Yes, it is troubled, but Lee Young Lee, who began Verse Like Water a decade ago, is right when he says the world always begins again. We look to a great poet today in a crisis time to provide us with the ultimate antidote to violence, which is beauty. And I know Forrest will help translate our fears about the past, present, and future into the other thing we need, which of course is hope. Let's give a warm Minnesota welcome to Forrest Gander.
Good. I was hoping I wasn't going to have to compete with that image of myself, even larger than life size. I'm really happy to be here, and I haven't been to this part of Minnesota before. I really like Minnesota. A lot of my relatives from Sweden ended up here, and it's been a real kick for me to be. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. Yeah. Okay. It's been a real kick for me to be around Professor Jeff Johnson, whose ebullience and passion for poetry and the spirit are absolutely contagious. I'd love to be a student of his. I'm going to start with, I like to share my poetry readings. Writing always comes from other writing. We feel writers are involved with other writers and with other books, and I like to acknowledge that. So I'm going to start with a poem that I translated by a Mexican poet. His name is Alfonso de Quino. He lives he was sort of famous as a 20-year-old. He was discovered by Octavio Paz. He won a big award, but he moved out of the city, Mexico City, into the desert, where he lives and knows all of the stars, the medicinal plants, the rocks around his place, even the lizards doing push-ups on those rocks. And this is a poem where he's talking about the relationship, this is going to kind of be a theme to my reading today, between the singular and the multiple, that what we think of as singular, a tree, a leaf, even our own bodies, is actually always a communion. It's always a mutuality, a collaboration. You right there in the Hill Star shirt, behind your knee, right now, there's thousands of bacteria that are part of your body. And under my arm, the same thing. And in your stomach, in your intestines, right now, there are helminth parasites that help you digest your food, that are part of your body. And even down at the deepest level in our DNA, there is DNA of organisms that long ago became incorporated into our system. We aren't, that whole idea that racism is based on, which is like blood purity, is so phony, because there is no blood purity. There's not even species purity. We are a collaboration. We're a communion of other creatures. So here's his poem. So this was a cool poem to translate because it's written in 2 columns. And they can be read either vertically and then vertically, or they can be read horizontally across. So I'm going to read the Spanish just down the left column, and then when I get to the English, I'll read it horizontally. Fronda. No tiene ninguna forma la hoja en medio de las hojas. Las hojas no son el aire, sino el aire que lo ocupa. Y una copa cabe en otra dentro de una sola hoja. Y una en otra se transforma como un cielo entre 2 hojas. Invisible rama loca se retuerce por sí sola. Si una hoja y otra hoja siempre son la misma hoja. So I'm reading this in part because I've been learning the local trees from Jeff Johnson, who knows the trees like the back of his hand. And this is a tree poem. It's called in English, Frond. And so now I'm going to read horizontally. It's formless. From within the leaves I see the leaf in the middle, one brushing another, of the leaves that keep it company. Leaves aren't the alder, all the tree a leaf, but the air that holds all the alder in its sleeve, and more leaves. And trees drink each other in, and a frond emerges from one of them, tangled in the branches, a singular leaf among the leaves. Gesticulation of that frond. From within the patterns I see, disclosing in the shadowed bower, another flower, the other flower. And each moves into the other, and the phylum transfloresces, like a sky, invisibly woven, and between 2 leaves, opening out. Wild, invisible branch, the stalk and the corolla twisting, spirals darkening into one form and digging in, if one leaf and another leaf, from the unseen branch, always are, in the shade of that leaf, the same leaf, falling broken. And I'll read another poem by someone else. This is also a poem, in a way, about something similar, about the frond of identity caught in the tangle of past and present. It's called In the High Days, and it's by a poet named Mark Conway. Those were the weeks of my pre-conversion, the sun clear as cider, preserving the late light of September. Roads led to roads, down to lanes, and dark cities, to taverns bursting with bow-legged women and pork swimming in au jus. It was then I'd such longings for the undoing of seasons, taking down summer's hair, smelling her unblemished cotton. Behind my motives I saw nothing but hunger, and went on, as the young do, lifting down the night bottle, taunting the stars as nothing, just the sky starting to rot. That town made me, swore me, to be done with the long burn. I converted my mysterious mind into water, made it clear as the night lying on cornfields. Summer evenings, the moon rises, tearing my old thoughts off, almost as though they never made me. And the rest of this reading will be from my most recent book, which is called Twice Alive. Which begins with a poem called Aubade, and Aubade is it's a poem written in early morning. This is for all of those that we've lost during the pandemic, including my mother, Ruth. Can you hear dawn edging close? Hear soft light with its vacuum fingertips gripping the bedroom wall? An understated, what? Exhilaration? Can you hear the voices, if they can be called voices, of towies scratching in the garden, and then the creaky, low, husky voice flecked with sleep beside you in bed, telling a dream slowly as though in real time. And now, interrupting that dream, can you make out the voice, if it can be called a voice, of absence speaking intimately to you, directly, using the names of those who are vulnerable, those who are gone? I know you must hear it feelingly, a low vibration in your bones, for don't you find yourself absorbed in a next moment beyond your given life? So this book, Twice Alive, begins with a note to the reader, which I should probably share with you before I read any more of the poems. So the note goes like this. What most of us learned in high school about lichen, that stuff on rocks, that it's an indicator species for pollution. Litmus, in fact, is derived from lichen. And that it's the synergistic alliance of a fungus and an algae, or a cyanobacteria. It's pretty much true, but simplified. Lichen ecology turns out to have a lot more to do with collaboration than competition, with communion. And collaboration is transformative. With lichen, which some scientists say may be more related to animals than plants, the original organisms, that cyanobacteria or algae and the fungus, are completely changed when they get together. They can't ever return to what they were. And according to Anne Pringle, one of the leading contemporary mycologists with whom I had the lucky opportunity to collaborate, it may be that lichen do not, given sufficient nutrients, age. Anne and other contemporary biologists are saying that our sense of the inevitability of death may be determined by our mammalian orientation. Perhaps some forms of life have theoretical immortality. The thought of two things that merge, mutually altering each other, two things that intermingled and interactive become one thing that does not age, brings me to think of the nature of human intimacy. Isn't it often in our most intimate relations that we come to realize that our identity, all identity, is combinatory? This is what looks like, I was a geology major, a piece of basalt from the campus that I'm going to, it's going to help me with this reading. So, a lot of science terms here. Don't let them disorient you. I want you to feel through the things that you don't understand towards the feeling. Mycobiont, just beginning to enwrap photobiont, each to become something else, its own life and a contested mutuality. Twice alive, algal cells swaddled in clusters. You take a three-lens jeweler's loop to inspect the holdfast of the umbilicate lichen, then the rock tripe lichen, then the irenic amanita mushroom swarming with a kind of mite that has no anus, then the delicious chanterelles called trumpets of death. Supreme parsimony and drought lets lichen live on sporadic events of dew and fog, a velvety tomentum, and the wet thallus. I crush oak moss between finger and thumb for its sweet perfume, persistent on your skin when I touch your throat, so slow to evaporate, the memory of seeing sunburst lichen on the sandstone cliff. But if herbivores eat wolf lichen, they die. And if carnivores eat it, they die writhing in pain, with the exception of mice. It is rarely possible to tell if lichen is dead or alive. The fuzz of fecal dust from lichenivorous mites triggers woodcutters' eczema, the bane of loggers knee-deep in sweet fern, sawing down cedar. So evening finds us at this wood's edge, where at a dead oak's base, shoestring rot glimmers, its luminescent rhizomes reflected from the eyes of a foraging raccoon that doesn't yet sense us. Air ghostly and damp clings as we step from our woods to look across the field toward the first lane of lit houses, their dull pewter auras restrained by wet haze. Cordyceps, the brown of your eyes softened with rain and remotely fluorescent, dissolve into slime after a few days. Whatever we thought we were following was following us, its intention linked to our own. The next poems that I'm going to read are influenced by a kind of poetry that was written in southern India 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago in southern India, there was this blossoming of literature that came to be called Sangam, which means convergence. And one of the styles of that literature is called Akam. It's a poetry in which personal emotions, like the nuances of love, are linked with landscape in such a way that human feeling is expressed as inseparable from the place where you have that feeling. It was considered not only unethical, but impossible to write about human feeling as though it weren't affected by the world around and in relationship to the human. Scholars of Sangam argue that the boundaries between inner landscapes and outer landscapes were considered porous, and that the ultimate goal of Sangam poetry was the dissolution of any split between self and landscape. This is something that comes up in the Bible in Ephesians too, where in Ephesians it says, it insists we are members of one another. again, that sense that inside us are other creatures and that we're constantly involved with the landscape around us, which is active, which has an influence on everything we feel. I think that part of the reason that we're in this environmental crisis that we're in, which is the biggest environmental crisis in human history, the winking out of species, the rapid depletion of oxygen in the oceans, you know all this stuff, is related to our sense of independence from the rest of the world and our feeling like the rest of the world is just there for our transactional purposes. And until we change that attitude of our relationship with what's around us, we're going to continue to suffer an incredible environmental crisis and the extinction of so many other species. So these poems, I live in Northern California now, where the landscape, the main 5 landscapes are the same 5 landscapes in the Sangam poems in southern India. So I've written poems influenced by Sangam, but that take place in California. Forest, with 1 R. Erogenous zones in oaks, slung with stoles of lace lichen, the sun's rays spilling through leaves in broken packets. A force, call it nighttime, thrusts mushrooms up from their lair of spawn, mycelial loam, the whiff of port. They pop into untrammeled air with a sort of gasp that follows a fine chess move. Like memories, are they? Or punctuation? Was it something the earth said to provoke our response, tasking us to recall an evolutionary course, our long ago initiation into the one among others? And within my newborn noticing, have you popped up beside me, love? Or were you here from the start, a swarm of meaning and decay still gripping the underworld? Both of us half buried, holding fast, if briefly, to a swelling vastness, while our coupling begins to register in the already awake compendium that offers to take us in. You take me in. And abundance floods us, floats us out. We fill each with the other. All morning breaks as birdsong over us, who rise to the surface, so our faces might be sprung. When I moved to California in 2016, almost immediately after I moved there, wildfires came and destroyed the town just north of me, which is called Santa Rosa. And 2 years later, wildfires, again caused by human influence on global warming, wiped out that same town again, Santa Rosa. This is called, one of the landscapes in the Sangam poems is Wasteland. This is Wasteland for Santa Rosa. Green spring grass on the hills had cured by June, and by July, gone woolly and brown. It crackled underfoot, desiccated, while within the clamor of live oaks, an infestation of tiny larvae clung to the underleaves, feeding between veins. Their frass, that fine dandruff of excrement and boring dust, tinkled as it dropped onto dead leaves below the limbs. You could hear it 20 feet away, tinkling. Across the valley on Sugarloaf Ridge, the full moon showed up, like a girl doing cartwheels. No one goes on living the life that isn't there. Below a vast column of smoke, heat, flame, and wind, I rose, swaying and tottering on my erratic vortex, extemporizing my own extreme weather, sucking up acres of scorched topsoil and spinning it outward in a burning sleet of filth and embers that catapulted me forward with my mouth open in every direction at once. So I came for you, turning the present into purgatory, because I need to turn everything to tragedy before I can see it, because it must be leavened with remorse for the feeling to rise. The next poem, the landscape is sea, and I'm been thinking, like lots of you have probably also around the world, this is the time of the greatest human migration in all of human history, people moving across borders. It's become an issue for lots of countries. And I'm living now with an immigrant in a partnership, and so thinking a lot about immigration, and also thinking that on every shore of every country, the ocean is a constant immigrant arriving. Immigrant C, aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him, watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him, so familiar and foreign? The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell, spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass positive, pollen negative, so when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet, like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself. And read to 10:45 or 12:45. Is that? Yeah. Well, I think what I'll do now is I'd like to show you a movie, or it's not exactly a movie. It's like a poetry film, and it's a collaboration that I did with a musician from Charlottesville, Virginia, named Brady Earnhardt, and a photographer named Lucas Folia. Lucas spent a lot of time traveling around the United States, living for periods like a month at a time, several weeks at a time, in what used to be called utopian communities, and are now most often called intentional communities. And these are people who, for various reasons, are living off the grid, away from the rest of society. Some of them, like the first person you'll see, are in groups of people that don't believe in killing anything. They eat roadkill and stuff they find in the forest. Others have left society for religious reasons, some for political reasons, but all of them working out independent, for them, utopian visions of what it's like to live away from the mass culture, mass American culture. And I listened to hundreds of hours of interviews with these people and began to weave together a poem made from their voices, which seems to me to speak very much to the American mindset. And so I'd like to share this collaboration with you.
The natural order of things. Sugar bushing. Some things we do would gross people out because they just don't know. always was baffled by the connections in life. It's moving around for the light. I thought, that plant's growing before my eyes. It's insane what the news media don't want you to know about. All the wild, edible plants, for instance. Getting on good here, blacks and white. No fossil fuel-based technology. I've eaten owl, wing mussels, and leg mussels. That's the only meat on it. All this roadkill, beavers, otters, deer, raccoon. We cook them up, preserve the hide instead of slashing it. Got it laid out real clear. A lot can be done with duct tape. A bucket of honey between May and August. Who controls oil controls the world. It's a lawyer's racket, but they don't go by law. That's the truth, and people don't even know it. Want to find my bearings and what's real. Started an anarchist collective with 13 others, like myself, independent people. Mountains seem to draw folks who want to live in wilderness. The biggest problems come from being disconnected. I did really well in school, but I didn't like it. How do you sustain yourself day to day? Take 5 milk goats and a sack of sweet potatoes, a grist mill, a harness shop. Most people independent enough to live out here like this. They're too independent to listen to each other. Feed somebody lunch and they cut your wood all year. That works. Until the kids are grown, don't want to bring others in on account of influence. Some things we do would gross people out because they don't know. Where do you think you come by your pattern for your axe handle? Take your old axe handle and lay it on there. Nobody comes in, nobody leaves. We'll mind ourselves, let us alone. They wear people out so they say, I'll just pay the fine. That's the truth, and people don't even know it. I was on her windshield, 20 or 30 feet, and then she hit the brakes, and I flew into a telephone pole. Heard a lot of stories about people's lives, who needs a house, and how much tin. We're different. You can't treat us the same. Garlic, pumpkin, onion, squirrel, and people come to learn to make sorghum. Those that have enough guts to live off the land, they are independent people like myself, but I lived in community, lived with the Amish. With them, wood cutting isn't cutting wood. Wood's a byproduct. That's why you can't use chainsaws. You can't talk to someone over a chainsaw. Want to move in a way that's more connected, see the cause and effect in my life. Right at the start of my senior year, a natural progression from activism and travel. How do you sustain yourself day to day? And people come to learn to make sorghum. What the news media don't want you to know. Those dogs, they're rabid dogs. Like to lose that feeling of being a foreigner, find a sense of being at home. Out felling trees alone on a windy day. Took my eyes off it for 3 seconds. A big gust of wind came up and blew it down on me. My first thought was, oh shit, I don't have insurance, which is a funny thought, considering. Let's get this process right. I'm not quitting unless I feel in my heart I'm going to quit. That's the difference between me and other people. Blue heron is good, tastes good. Never eat a blue heron? Supervisor said there's no common law in Virginia. We don't know how fast it's going to happen. Food's going to be number 1. Next is going to be ammo. We figure we'll end up feeding a lot of people. Took my eye off it for 3 seconds. First thought was, oh shit, it's a right. It's always been a right. The difference between me and other people. We'll care for ourselves. Let us alone. I've got it laid out real clear. Biggest problems come from being disconnected. Beavers, otters, deer, raccoon. I've eaten owl. Hard to feed yourself for a year. Milk goats are the most valuable thing you can have. Banks go down, people can't get money. They're going to see what they need. Food's number 1, and next is going to be muscles and leg muscles. That's the only meat on him. Where do you think you come by your pattern? Let's get this process right. Want to find my bearings and what's real. Move in a way that's more connected.
Thank you. Just a little thing about translation. I really encourage people who have a little of another language to translate, even if you're not completely fluent. If you pick a contemporary writer and get in touch with them, they'll be delighted. And if your translation's the first translation, no matter how bad it is, it's going to be the best translation in the world. And living in a country where our language has displaced the languages of so many other languages around the world, it can be not just an aesthetic activity, but an ethical activity to recognize other languages and bring them into English. And it's a tricky process that a lot of ethics is involved in. There's a passage sort of connects to the theme of my reading today, by San Juan de Yepes, mostly known as St. John of the Cross. He has a poem that begins, "Entreme donde no supe, y quédame no sabiendo, toda ciencia trascendiendo." So you could translate it problematically as, I entered into unknowing and remained there without knowing, rising above all science. But then the cool thing about it is that in Spanish, the Bible begins, not in the beginning was the Word, but anybody know what it says in Spanish? So it's not the word. In Spanish, it's the verb. God is a verb. And so when St. John of the Cross begins his poem, he could say, yo entré, I entered. But he doesn't. He starts with the verb. And doing that, he's saying that the verb, God, controls the sentence of his life as he controls the grammatical sentence. So as a translator, you'd have to think about that and figure out how you wanted to resolve that in English, because it sounds weird to start in English. Entered into unknowing, or entered I into unknowing. That sounds phony. So you have to work through things like that. But it's really been a valuable part of my life. It's connected me to other communities around the world. So that's the end of my reading. Do any of you have comments or questions? I'm curious about the first poem I read, which has a bunch of scientific terms in it. I'm serious question is whether you feel alienated by that language and kind of start to drift off immediately, or whether in some way it makes sense to you. An honest answer would be helpful to me in sort of another form. Yeah.
I think it's good. It makes everything, like, it just seems like it connects better because there's a specific way that it goes together.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping, is that when there are words that you don't know, that the context sort of gives you a pretty good clue to the word. And then the words themselves have, texture and the linguists say that language makes meaning before we have semantic meaning, that language is making meaning as sound and always has. That before before we even know what the words are, we're registering the meaning of the sounds. And that in lots of languages, almost all languages, there are familiar patterns to sounds. Like this means no. And in almost every language, women will talk to babies with an uplifting tilt to their voice. And in almost every language, the deeper U's and O sounds, O and oo, are connected to more profound emotions than the tweeter sound. All of that is affecting you even before you register what a word means. And that's something that poets have to be very conscious of, and translators too. Anybody? Yeah.
Like in all of the poems, where nature was very prominent, and it was seemed very inspirational to you. If you could elaborate on how nature inspires you.
So I don't think it has to be just nature, that in the city also you can pay attention to what's around you. There is nature around you everywhere you go. Lichen, for instance, my sort of metaphor for reading, is on over 90% of the Earth's surface. You'll find lichen. It's everywhere. But that sense that we're in an environmental crisis of an intense magnitude that's going to affect all of you and all of your children, I think is connected to our feeling of not being connected to the world. That the world becomes transactional material. We dig it for what we need. We cut it down for what we need. But we're forgetting that we're dependent upon an interdependency of all these species that are part of who we are, and that it's trying to reimagine a way of our connectedness is what I'm trying to do. Yeah.
When you translate a poem English to Spanish, do you think that the English translation is worse than the original, or do you think that the translated poem is just
That's a really tricky question, and it sort of varies. So I can only translate into English. I can't. When I try to translate English into Spanish, which I try to do in kind of sucks, because I think you sort of have to translate into your native language. But and when you translate, things don't come across the same way. Like in Spanish, there's lots of sounds, all those vowel sounds that we don't have as commonly in English, and so it's going to sound different. Wordplay isn't going to happen the same way in English that it happens in Spanish. But you look for places, maybe I can get some wordplay to happen in English somewhere else, so that there's a kind of equivalence of involvement in the poem. So I think that the translation can be as good as a poem, as the original poem. But that it's always a struggle, and it's always going to be different, because words have different connotations in different languages. Rings them. You have some Spanish? Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. What year are you? So what in school? One second. Are you thinking about college? Well, if you go to college, you might explore some classes in creative writing or translation. It's great. And even in your life now, keep up with those two languages. Don't lose one, because the future is going to be multilingual for sure. failure. Also, even though I'm up here, I've sort of gotten okay at like presentations and stuff. I'm really uncomfortable actually in talking to people, and so I would always sort of write the things that I wasn't saying to people, and that did it. But also, my mom read me poetry, so I was hearing poetry early on. Poetry and art have gotten into me. I feel like they often sort of open up my perspective so that I'm seeing in a different way than I saw before, or something that I felt and never articulated for myself. Somebody else has articulated, and in reading that, I become smarter and more compassionate and sort of wider. And that art and poetry connect us to empathy. And empathy is maybe the most important.
I appreciate your honesty. It's probably the most reassuring thing for me to say.
Yeah.
A second part to that question is, if you experience it, how can you avoid burnout?
Would get burned out, but a lot of, I mean, for me, when I get burned out of writing, I have translation that I go to. Other people have musical instruments that they go to. Something else that's creative that can be a kind of, like when you're caught in a, what is it when the ocean carries you out? Riptide. You're sort of caught in a riptide of depression or blockedness in one thing. You swim sideways on your other arm. And it's not your main arm, but when you come back to shore, you're in a different place and you might be re-energized. Yeah.
As someone that has a hard time understanding poetry, do you have any advice for, like, I guess me to, when reading poetry, like, understand kind of what it's meaning?
Yeah. So my first suggestion is don't worry about scrambling after trying to make it all mean something logical. Because most art uses things that get us out of logic. Never in human history have we depended so much on logical speech. There's always been shamans and visionaries and other kinds of language that people use that didn't work in terms of just strict logic. And poetry can offer that up. I think art and poetry that somewhere between the brain and the genitals, it strikes us like where the heart is. It's got some brain and neurotics in it, but that we have to feel it first, and we let that feeling lead us to sort of an understanding. It doesn't have to be this poem is about, you know, blah 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 blah. And that ruins poetry, I think. Yeah.
In 2017, Bob Dylan received the Nobel Peace Prize. And
Not Peace Prize, but the Nobel Prize for Literature.
For literature, correct. And when he was honored, they gave examples of his, like he said the word steel in the song. He did a song like, he stretched it out, and it was remarkable. And for the young people here, have them listen to Dylan perhaps, or read some of his verses, because they're so powerful.
They're super powerful. We all love Dylan. We're all rooting for him. And even though he doesn't publish his stuff as poetry, he's certainly been a poetic bard and influence on the huge influence on our culture and literature. And he stole too. I mean, he borrowed from poets that he was reading, Rimbaud and Verlaine, and Dante. He mentions and read a verse from the 13th century. Yeah. I mean, the more poetry you read, the more comfortable you begin to find your way in it. And you don't have to like all of it. Some of it's bad. So, it still gets published. So follow what your instincts lead you to.
One more question.
Yes.
If you had the chance, do you think you ever write a poem about war?
About war? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Yes, I have written about war.
Would you write one about recent events?
Mhm.
Would you write one about recent events?
Yeah. So yes, I would. Yes, I think it's important to address what's going on in our time, including that. And my only hesitation is that there's been lots of bad political poetry where people write too quickly into it. And, you know, Neruda has some god-awful poems that are political poems. And a lot of political poets do. So I would just want to be careful that I wasn't rushing into it. But I think addressing the major issues of our time is something that poetry has always done and must do. And I'm certainly, like maybe you are, completely riveted to what's going on right now. That's supposed to be in Poland next month. But the people that were hosting me, their house is now full of refugees.
Well, Forrest is going to sign some books right now. We'll reconvene here for the craft talk at 1:30. I hope you circle back next year. This fall, First Like Water is going to bring us Kevin Young, Belgina Mort, Ilya Kaminsky, and Nikolai Medzirov. My students know that one of the things that I live for is the poet hug. And while you bid farewell to Forrest, I'm going to grab it right now.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks a lot.